I think we will all agree that the two presentations have been very rich indeed, and certainly brought home certain ideas that might not indeed have been self-evident. For example, the importance of Caribbean diasporic artistic communities in enabling archives or pressuring or even stimulating archives to acquire particular kinds of papers. The question of global citizenship when writers live in different parts of the world and how that affects the politics, indeed, of acquiring any particular archive. And of course, we had a very interesting presentation which raised a series of questions about thinking beyond the book itself and the ways in which publishers' archives might be used and might generate information that is of use to the scholar. I think we have we've actually gone beyond our time, but we can entertain, I think, about 4 questions. Okay. So please address your questions to Gail and to Alice.
Hello, thank you for a wonderful panel. It's just such a treat to be here and to hear the kind of work that's going on with Walcott Studies. My question is for Gail. I almost fell off my chair the other day when you mentioned that unpublished novel. So I'm just wondering if you could give us a fuller context for in which you found the reference to Passage to Paradise.
The reference to the novel which is called Passage to Paradise, which was sent to Swansea in 1952. It's part of this. You'll actually see it in the Swansea collection, which is either at Birmingham or here. The photocopies are here. And I think Swansea actually then also charts who he sent it to. But he also seems to have some reservations about it. But he says that he will send it on anyway, and he does send it on. I think I've seen a reference in the Cape collection to why they might not want to publish that. But that's my only sense of that, and I've never ever seen the manuscript before. But I obviously don't work with literary manuscripts as much as I work with publishing manuscripts. Publishing archives. So I don't know if that manuscript actually exists here. I know Peter Killenny actually talks about it in a little footnote in his new book, Commonwealth of Letters, in which that PMLA kind of issue little article that appears in PMLA actually appears is collected as part of his new book, and there might be something newer there. But I've only got Peter's new book kind of 2 days ago, and I haven't read it. I mean, it's also interesting to think that actually that Walcott would feel that he would need to have written a novel somehow, because of course novels. I mean, I was having this conversation with Andrew Nash about possibly speculating about why he would write a novel. And it might be, of course, a novel does actually have much more financial return. It gives you much greater financial return if it is successful in a way that poetry will never do. But can anyone else I'm not a Walcott scholar myself, so I'd be really happy to hear from anyone else on this lost novel or unpublished novel.
Writing. I don't know anything. Any other questions? It was particularly interesting to hear about the kinds of politics involved in acquiring particular archives. We're in competition with each other here, in terms of the Walcott. Are there any questions? Yes?
I just wanted to ask Jennifer, and I think Lorraine's still here as well, that question about the possibility. You said there were some tentative explorations about the possibility of a mirrored collection, so that the Trinidad holdings would be copied for Toronto, and Toronto holdings for Walcott could be copied for Trinidad. And I wondered if that tentativeness was around resource, or was around kind of questions of whether people felt that the attraction of their own archive would be compromised if there was a mirror. I know these are kind of sensitive questions, but I just thought it might be interesting. This is an interesting arena for us to kind of raise those questions. And I don't know whether, obviously you can give the Toronto perspective. I didn't know whether there was anybody who might be able to give the Trinidad perspective on that also. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Alison. I think the biggest issue with that would be resources, staffing and funding, and hosting, depending what decisions were made regarding digitization. We'd certainly be willing, in a sense, but it's usually resources that hold these things up. And I think Derek Walcott himself has always been very positive and supportive of nearly any use of his archives and his work. He's really pleased to be studied and disseminated. He's not a private person like some authors, and he's not concerned about restrictions or generally about copyright, within reason. So that's my impression.
I don't know if anybody from St. Augustine, the library in St. Augustine is here. Yeah, because I do know from my own use of the two archives that there are quite different policies in place in terms of photocopying. Yes?
Yes. Earlier, Clark, you did mention that Kathleen Helenice Paul, who is no longer there with us, she has retired. She started that initiative to discuss the possibility of bringing the archives together virtually. And I know at one point some attempts at grantsmanship, at writing for grants to support that, also played out, and we never got anything out of it. But that doesn't mean that we can't discuss this in the future. So there is still scope for it, and it's something that we can revisit.
Absolutely. And we might consider something like the Internet Archive, who happen to be based in Toronto in the main library. They're sort of experimenting with digitizing some archives now. They're moving on from books. So there's some possibilities there. They're not expensive. It might be possible to consider something with them.
But you would consider in some ways that whole project to be enhancing the archive rather than, as Alice said, compromising it.
Yes, in this case, for sure, certainly, because we'd have the support of the creator.
Yeah.
I can think of many authors who wouldn't be in favor for a number of reasons.
I just wanted to ask a question of the two librarians from my own experience. It seems to me that the permissions that are needed to use the archival material at Toronto are different from the permissions needed to use the archival material at St. Augustine. So I don't know if St. Augustine would care to.
One of the things with negotiating the papers for any archive we acquire, the agreements tend to be very individual. So although we will have basic terms, sometimes authors will have specific requirements. So like when we acquired the Walcott papers, there was in that agreement a clause which had placed some items on embargo, and then that was eventually released. Also, some authors prefer, because they are still active and they're working with material, they prefer that if persons are getting copies, they would rather not give copies for that archive. So each archive then will have particular terms. So that also will influence how we manage the archive and manage access to that archive. But what we do, we ensure that whatever policies apply to it, it's publicly accessible. So therefore, in the case of Walcott papers, we would not provide complete copies of the archives to anyone. And I don't think anyone does that outright.
No.
So that governs one of the principles there with our archives. Hope that clarifies.
And at one point, Walcott sent us a letter saying he does not wish to be bothered every time someone wants a copy.
Whereas in St. Augustine,
So we stopped.
yeah.
Right, yes.
Actually, Walcott gave me permission to photocopy the entire Walcott archive in 1993.
Yeah, okay. I'm glad that you mentioned that, Jennifer, because sometimes when we are negotiating and we explain to persons, okay, if you don't want us to allow people to copy, note that when persons ask for copies, we will be sending them to you. And it's after a while, in managing that process, they realize it's a bother. So I'm glad that Walcott just tell you, okay, handle it. You know, it makes it easier for the institution to manage, especially when users don't understand why there has to be another step in that process in providing them with access.
Thank you very much. Any other questions? What about, yeah. Yes. Sorry, I can't see very well. No. Kim, yes.
Hi, just two comments. First of all, Jennifer sounded a little apologetic, perhaps, about the fact that there was a Walcott collection at Toronto, University of Toronto. I don't know if I misinterpreted the tone, but if there was any sense of a need to apologize, I just want to say that quite often there is the problem originating in the Caribbean, where the Caribbean doesn't really appreciate, and I think this point was raised earlier, doesn't appreciate these assets. So it's wonderful that University of Toronto did. You mentioned some negotiation with Alistair McIntyre, or discussion with Alistair McIntyre and Ted Chamberlain. And I somehow seem to remember that UWI it's not that UWI was weeping and wailing and gnashing its teeth that they didn't have the money. They just didn't think it was a priority.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Well, there
Okay.
was money. That's why I mentioned the fact that there was almost a pressure group of a community in Toronto.
Oh, yes.
And that's why I mentioned
yes.
it. And they were right. There's an artistic community in Toronto that would have given an
Very
impetus.
Vocal and active
Yeah.
community. Yes.
And another just small point, the question of the mysterious novel manuscript. I don't know anything about it, but I was interested in Gail's conjecture that Walcott may have thought it was more remunerative to write a novel. It could simply be that he just wanted to write a novel.
Yes, of course. Yes,
And
yes,
it
you're
could
absolutely
simply be
right.
that the novel was just not very good.
Yeah.
And maybe the fact that it was not very good means it was destroyed because it might have been embarrassing. Just throwing that out.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
Okay, we can have one final question, and then we have to have coffee and return almost immediately. Yes?
So I just wanted to know if you have thought of asking Walcott about that document.
I'll ask him. We'll ask him. We'll ask him. Okay, thank you very much, and thank you both, Jennifer, and for two extremely interesting presentations. Thank you.